Soma and Psyche. Carl Jung said, "The world today hangs by a thin thread, and that thread is the psyche of man." Adam Weishhaup said, "Man is not bad except as he is made so by arbitrary morality. He is bad because of religion, the state, and bad examples pervert him." The existence of evil lies purely within a perceptual dualism of the universe. There is nothing wrong within the universe, only our thinking about it, which is inherently dualistic. Before thought there is no duality. Being precedes thought, and in Martin Heidegger's estimation, thought is not grounded in being, and therefore the content of one's mind does not exist in the sense of being alive and real. Herein lies the ultimate chicken and egg situation between realism and idealism that we've played with ourselves since we could think about thinking, as mentioned earlier. Ultimately, all evil arises from separation, what Gerald Massey called in modern times disease subjectivity. The paradoxical nature of evil is found within the word itself, considering that in occultism, words that are phonetically similar are thought to be explanatory of each other. When evil is reversed, it yields life, live, and love, or ephil, evil, and evol, respectively. In the Gnostic astrological tradition, the planet Saturn is both Sapphire, goddess of wisdom, and Satan, the tester. The Knights Templar supposedly worshipped a hermaphrodite pagan deity called Baphomet, which embodied both aspects of Saturn. Frederick Nicolai claimed that Baphomet came from the Greek words Baphometus, meaning baptism of wisdom. Indeed, when the word Baphomet is decoded using the Atbash Gematria cipher, it gives the name Sapphire. Baphomet was a guise to keep the inquisitors and the untutored at loss. Moving on, John Zerzan said, "The root of civilization's ruin goes as deep as all the devices which enable our conceptual separation from the world." Oscar Wilde said, "There is nothing that will cure the senses but the soul, and nothing that will cure the soul but the senses." We live on a planet, but we have divided it into two worlds that could not be more different. The first world is biological and real. We cannot survive without it. The second world is an archonic imitation of the first. Civilization stems ultimately from our misconception of the self. Our contemporary problem actually started some 5,000 years ago, when our ancestors put aside the more egalitarian, gender-balanced ways of earlier human societies and established the rule of domination. Language in the broadest sense is the technology upon which everything else in a culture depends. Without a shared semiotic space, people in the culture have no way of relating to each other. Every society has a language, but not every society has a culture or is part of civilization. Animals have no culture, yet many organize themselves into societies for survival reasons. Their mode of communication is almost entirely instinctual rather than symbolically mediated. Likewise, indigenous peoples form societies, but they cannot be said to have a culture of such, rather something much more primal, a proto-culture. Language as we generally understand it is an exclusively human sphere. This leads us blindly into anthropocentrism. We conceptualize the world from a human point of view without considering other species. We give ourselves human rights, but we do not extend the same privileges to animals and the earth itself. They are secondary concerns. Our relationship with the natural world tends to become adversarial. We see it as a force imposing upon our civilization. R.D. Lang said, "We are effectively destroying ourselves by violence masquerading as love." Nature is a dangerous word because we have a tendency to see it as something pristine, something over there that needs saving. Nature is just an abstraction unless we experience the interconnectedness of everything. So long as we see nature as something separate from ourselves, then we continue to objectify it as if it were something that we could hold in our hands or control in some way. Yet the more we seek to manage and control nature, the more unmanageable and uncontrollable our problems become. Without being able to consciously identify with the living earth, we are unconsciously destroying ourselves. We feel ourselves to be no longer embedded within the natural world. As Woody Allen said, "The earth and I are two." While spending time in the natural world seems like common sense, many people today see it as a chore, as something that they have to try and fit into their busy lives. How many people look at the stars? How many people walk barefoot on the grass? How many children have never seen the countryside? Wilhelm Reich said, "Only knowledge of that which is alive can banish terror." And Terence McKenna said, "Nature is not mute, it is man who is deaf." Ecopsychology is a combination of the disciplines of ecology and psychology. It aims to provide ways of healing our alienation from the natural world, co-evolving towards a sane and sustainable society. Life works in such a way that all cells must become mutually dependent upon each other in order to build a living body. The force that creates and sustains life is a force of giving and sharing based on a balanced relationship between all its holons. Theodore Roszak writes, "The id is that very proto-human psychic core that our evolution has spent millions of years moulding to fit the planetary environment. Its seeming unruliness deserves a deeper understanding, if only because it grows from a long evolutionary history. In the course of that history, its dominant characteristics must have been selected for some good reason." John Seed said, "People are willing to die by the millions in defense of one social fiction after another, a religion or political system or ideology, yet attacks on the earth which give rise to all of these, and without which none could exist, leave us numb." The basic idea of eco-psychology is that we are all evolutionarily adapted to the natural world, and as such have an innate latent instinct to emotionally connect with the natural world. This is called the biophilic instinct. The neglect of this instinct and grounding of biological nature causes a wide range of physical and psychological illnesses. Personal and planetary well-being are two sides of the same coin. The natural cycles of the earth profoundly affect the body, just as the seasons affect vegetation. In traditional societies, it is understood that sanity and madness have to be defined always in relation to the natural environment. Madness is understood to be an imbalance between the individual and the natural environment. Koyaanisqatsi. After all, humans have lived peacefully for 98% of our evolutionary time on Earth. Archaeological evidence suggests that until several thousand years ago, humans lived in egalitarian and nature-based societies that revered life. Only around 300,000 years ago did we become nomadic hunter-gatherers in tribal groups, and then later settled into Neolithic villages around 12,000 years ago. Of course, when such evidence emerges to show the success of pre-literate people, we don't want to hear about it. We will feverishly deny it and project our anxiety onto them in order to maintain the myth of progress. We tend to think of civilization as an advancement of what came before it, and therefore the concept of living embedded within the natural world appears as an inferior form of adaptation. Gestation reflects the evolutionary development of human beings. The masculine left hemisphere of the brain is the newer sibling. In utero, the feminine right hemisphere of the brain develops much sooner than the left hemisphere. Evolutionary biologists consider humans to be essentially an unevolving species. With the advent of culture, we have moved the role of evolution from genetics to epigenetics, from biology to technology. Schlein highlighted a noteworthy predicament that may have led to this evolutionary adaptation. He pointed out that humans have a very high maternal death rate, which he suggested was caused by an oversized cranium within the unborn child, in contrast to the small pelvic region of females. Schlein proposed that evolution's way of dealing with this particular problem was for us to develop language as a tool which allowed us to begin our ascent into culture. We have moved from human beings to human doings. The right hemisphere of the brain is grounded in the somatic, in the felt experience of the now. The right hemisphere specializes in non-verbal communication, therefore there is no symbolic interference with direct perception of reality. The right brain perceives the world concretely. For example, facial expressions can be read without any attempt to translate it into words. The his story of civilization is the rule of patriarchy, of the rigid social conventions of the right-hand path. We have long been told to believe that human nature is evil. That itself provides the justification for theocracy. We are told we must live in sin and repent, blindly submitting to the social order and handing over all our power to the state, the fatherly ego. In fact, in order to maintain social order, it is essential that human nature is repressed, that it is reduced to civilized behavior. However, as Freud noted, subjugation of human instincts leads to mental pathology. Such repression reverses the life instinct, eros, and thus produces a drive towards death and destruction, i.e. thanatos. Whilst Freud admitted that it may be difficult to accept his view of human nature is predisposed towards death and destruction, he reasoned that life and civilization are born and develop out of an eternal struggle between the two interpersonal forces of love and hate. Therefore, the conditioned self fears the very freedom that it so desperately desires. In exchange for freedom, one must give up predictability and control. Wilhelm Reich took Freud's libidinal ideas further and suggested that when people are deprived of a satisfying sexual love, their repression turns into aggression. However, that is still only part of the larger somatic trauma that plays out in our society. Erich Fromm noted, For Freud, the historical process is essentially tragic. The more man creates culture, the more does he frustrate his instinctual drives, the more unhappy and neurotic does he become. Elis Kefas said, "Far from protecting us, the rational mind, with its rigid order and need to control the uncontrollable, only serves to enrage the demons of the unconscious." A repressive society leads to a lack of transcendence and consequently a decline in socially acceptable behavior. Western culture in particular fundamentally stampedes over the traditions of the past, leading to a form of psychological displacement. The contemporary decline in patriarchal values enshrined in Judeo-Christian culture for millennia coincides with the growing anti-authoritarian movement, along with a general decline in the archetypal masculine values. However, an unfolding archetype cannot be dispensed from the self. If it is rejected by a negative conscious attitude, then it will return to the unconscious and reassert itself through subversive or antisocial forms. The myth of progress heralded by civilization is uncannily similar to that of an addict. Easy to maintain in the beginning, but as with any addiction, it soon demands increasingly complex structures and resources to support it. Carl Jung said, "Modern man does not understand how much his rationalism has put him at the mercy of the psychic underworld." Herbert Marcuse argued that modern capitalism is preventing us from reaching a non-repressive society because of the alienation caused by objectification. He reasoned that this created false needs and commodity fetishism, whereby social relationships are mediated by symbolic attribution. Therefore, a person seeks to resolve their experience of alienation through conspicuous consumption, what Morris Berman called secondary satisfaction. The increasing commodification of life is hard to deny. Everything has a price, even life itself. This is the lethal meme of capitalism. It prevents us from seeing the interrelational value between things because everything is abstracted into purely monetary terms dictated by the invisible hand of market forces. Yet what is money but an agreement about the meaning of symbols? Anything that can be exploited is seen as a resource. For example, when we treat food as a commodity and product of consumption, we inevitably remove ourselves from our relationship with nature. Michael Sarian said, "The difficulty of egoic existence is that humanity has been gradually losing contact with reality. After all, animosity towards nature is ultimately animosity towards the real." Whereas Confucius said, "Signs and symbols rule the world." In the 21st century, the unreal dominates most people's lives, which are now saturated with nothing more than symbolic interchanges. Symbols don't just mediate our reality, they replace it. Jean Baudrillard described this as the procession of the simulacra. Baudrillard claimed that our current society has replaced all reality and meaning with symbols and signs, and that human experience is therefore a simulation of reality. Or as Morpheus fittingly said, the world that has been pulled over your eyelids to blind you from the truth. Consequently, we become lost in the ocean of the hyperreal, unaware that the land beneath our feet has submerged. Without knowing we are lost, we cannot be found. All of this woeful abstraction can be traced back to the distancing effect of language. Language serves as a tool of repression, because as soon as something is symbolized, it becomes divorced from its ineffable essence. Striving to represent the world, we inevitably forfeit its direct presence, and therefore our relationship with the planetary other is a broken one. Jerry Manders said, "Mankind's self-alienation has reached such a degree that it can experience its own destruction as an aesthetic pleasure of the first order." The alienation from the natural world is mirrored within our culture by the alienation between body and mind. As Gabriel Marcel said, the problem of the reality of the body is shown to be the central problem, and upon its solution everything else depends. Our technology entertains the mind and atrophies the senses of the body. We try in vain to recreate our somatic oneness through cultural images, because fundamentally the movement away from the somatic to the symbolic is a movement from a kinesthetic to a visual mode of perception. Consequently, we can only see with our eyes and not with our entire being. Morris Berman said, "Human identity is heavily conditioned by what happens to the infant body." Furthermore, Reich pointed out that characterology and culture go hand in hand, that what appears in the infant body is created by the surrounding culture, which in turn reproduces that culture. Birth is the original wound of separation that we all recoil from as we are plunged helplessly into this thing we call life. How infants are born and raised is fundamentally important to the psychological well-being of society. Arthur Janov has argued that the traumas surrounding birth today are so great that it results in lifetime careers of overeating, smoking, alcoholism, and every other form of neurotic splitting and dependence. In tribal societies, rites of passage provided a form of sacred initiation into the mysteries. our culture lacks such transformative rituals, which denies us from fully entering into adulthood. Many adults, therefore, psychologically resemble teenagers who have never grown up. Such rituals were seen as the foundation for sustaining the community by providing members of the tribe with a profound experience of self-discovery through psychological death and rebirth. Perhaps the fact that our culture does not provide rituals of initiation is not simply a massive cultural omission, but rather reflects and even impels the collective to be initiated in the most apocalyptic way. Destruction is creation.